We are so much more connected than we think. So much more than we can possibly imagine. In June, just a few weeks ago, I took an intensive immersion class where we spent 2 weeks on the US-Mexico border, and we were studying it through the lens of theology. And it was intense. I can barely begin to describe everything that we did. We met with folks ranging from the Border Patrol, the officers themselves, and had a tour of the border fortifications on the US side, to nuns in Tijuana offering free medical care to anyone who should come to their trailer in the red light district. We crossed into Mexico 5 times, and every day, either in Mexico or the US, we went to a different place. And then every afternoon, we'd come back and we'd hear the news of the families being separated and the US policy cracking down more and more and criminalizing more and more people. So it was disorienting. It was not just a travel across miles of space. It was also time travel. Our group could feel connections not only to the people living now, but also to those who have gone before. We learned that people have gathered in that region for 10,000 years minimum. And we could feel and see the tracks and notice the comings and goings of about 500 years of people from every continent. And we could feel their presence for good and for ill. We felt connections to the people coming after us, too. We met a young man from Venezuela, a refugee with his mother, and during our visit, he graduated from high school. And then we also met in Tijuana a 10-year-old girl who accompanied us with her mother on our trip to see the work that her mother is doing as part of an environmental justice collective. And this is a group, as I'll tell you in a minute, where the children are now starting to come up and take leadership. And there were strange connections across space, too, across long distances. Another mother told us how her son, who's 19, has gone to study in the Czech Republic. And she misses him like crazy, her only child. But she's glad he's there because he's safer. She feels like the gun violence, which we have here too. We who are mothers know now our children can be shot in school. And she has the same feeling. She's glad he's in a place where the gun violence is less. And then I found out in my own research, according to the LA Times, an average of 580 guns per day are being illegally exported from the US to Mexico. 580 a day. So when I say we're connected, that's not always a good thing. We love, as Unitarian Universalists, to celebrate the interdependent web of life and respect the interdependent web of life. And we think of that as relating to the natural environment. But that web of life includes our social systems, too, and ways we don't want to be connected, like smuggling weapons. So in this way, our 7th principle also relates to our 6th principle. Does anybody remember the 6th principle? No? It's the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Now you notice we say that as a goal because we have not achieved it yet, right? And we know human society is complicated on many levels, from our families to our democracy, even our church, as we have already talked about. And this profound ambiguity in the interdependent web actually is our theological challenge. And this is what we had to confront through the lens of theology on the border. The question of theology, for me, is basically a question about power. It's a question of who's in charge or what is in charge. Is it good or evil? And power is both good and evil. So we're connected through the interdependent web through both good and evil. We feel the heart connections. We see the beauty of the earth, and we struggle. We seek the good, but it's not always guaranteed. It's never guaranteed. So how can we get closer to the good? That's what we were wrestling with. So I mentioned this environmental justice collective. In this neighborhood of Tijuana called Chilpancingo, the streets and houses are built along a small little river. It's almost more like a creek, and most of it has actually been forced into concrete culverts or canal. They say canalized. And when you stand along the street in Chilpancingo and you look up to the ridge, along the ridge top are rows and rows of factories, these low, flat-roofed, they are called maquiladoras. And this area is famous for manufacturing TVs, and they put together the insides of the same TVs that we have in our houses. And women have worked in these plants and noticed pollution in the water of this river, and noticed they get sick when they go to work, and noticed their children getting sick, and notice that people are getting poisoned, and they know from their doctors it's because of the waste and the runoff coming from these factories through the soil and the water. And they found out that a lot was coming from an abandoned battery recycling factory that was leaching chemicals into the soil, and no one was doing anything about it. And it was completely illegal, but the owner of the factory had abandoned it and left for the US. There was lead, there was mercury, and they began to organize. And it took years of organizing, but they won, and the battery factory site was cleaned up. And then they started to win a few other things. They started to win back pay, because when the factories close, and they do come and go pretty often, they don't always honor the labor laws. So they got some of the laws enforced and got some back pay. Were able to make some home improvements so that they can live a little more comfortably and safer. And because of this success, this group, the Colectivo Chilpancingo, is known actually internationally now as a reckoning force. And the children are starting to step forward. Not all of them are still just 10. Some of them are 25 now and have grown up doing this work for their whole life. And so that's one way that this community is connected and to both its past and its future. It's one way to nourish the interdependent web through people coming together. And the Colectivo knows better than anyone, the pollution is still there. The work is never done. So we asked one of the leaders who's been there for a long time, and her name is Magdalena Cerda. And we asked her, what keeps you going? And she was ready with an answer, but it was not what I expected. I thought she would tell us about her gym routine or her meditation practice, because that's what I need to work on. That's what we all have to do to keep going. But instead, what she said was, what keeps me going is my human dignity. She spoke not only about her personal and internal sense of dignity, but about how she believes that her dignity comes from God and connects then with other people in their human dignity, so that when people come together in mutual respect, that makes a holy communion with God. And even as guests, and even as people with many different religious backgrounds different from her own, we felt so included and so part of this network of human dignity. We felt like love and grace was just blossoming as she spoke. And this was another way to nourish the interdependent web. And the Colectivo is going even deeper than that. Their next project is to preserve the last little stretch of their river that has not been turned into a concrete canal. It's just a tiny little segment, and the water's full of algae, and it's pretty messy. But the riverbank is still curving and natural, and it's still damp, and there are healing plants that grow. They pointed out a healing plant. The people come there to gather. It needs to grow in muddy water, in muddy earth by a riverbank, and it can't grow in a concrete culvert. And the trees are there, and the birds are singing, and the trees are still growing. And we didn't see that many trees, but there were plenty by the riverbank. What a beautiful way to care for the interdependent web. So Magdalena is known for telling students when they visit from the US and get inspired to help, she says, go home and get involved there. And we heard a story about a church youth group that when they visited, they were upset by the condition of a lot of the houses. And they had volunteered in their community with Habitat for Humanity. So they said, how about if we bring a Habitat group and build houses for you? And Magdalena said, the way to help us is to work in your own community. Work on your problems where you are and go deep, go deeper. And yet, sometimes that's hard because we don't always see what's going on in our own communities, especially if we've been people of privilege who even, and I have noticed this for myself, we get steered to not see because we are taught that it is not okay to notice suffering, and it's more okay for suffering to be hidden. And so we can't even find it sometimes when we go looking, but it is there. And if this is true for any of us, because I know it's not true for everyone, and we also all confront suffering at moments in our lives, but if we find that we're not seeing it, we must turn our wheels in a new direction, because that's how we connect. So these are the words of Robert McAfee Brown, who was an important theologian and activist and a professor at both Pacific School of Religion and Stanford University. He said, stand up and speak on behalf of the poor and those who need your voice in the world. Remember that where you stand determines what you see. Whom you stand with will determine what you hear. And what you see and hear will determine what you say and how you act. What you see and hear will determine what you say and how you act. So this is important. We need to choose wisely where we stand and who we stand with. And let us take care not to plant ourselves in our everyday lives too far away from the struggles that are happening in our own communities. In every community, I know there are ways that injustices are going on. In my community in Richmond, we have had demonstrations at the West Contra Costa Detention Center for the last many months. And it's a good thing because people have learned how to get there. It's a little off the beaten track for some. But yesterday, there were a lot of people there. And it really helps that a certain number of people have already been going for months and even years to raise their voices, knowing that it's one of the facilities that ICE contracts with to house people who are detained. So there are immigrants in our communities, there are people in prison in our communities. I know you know there are people who can't afford rent and can't afford medical care, and we are all getting closer to that in some ways. So we have to stay with the situation. We have to go deep into the roots and follow the example of the Colectivo. And how we follow that example, especially, is by honoring that human dignity that the Colectivo lifts up. We have to honor the capacity of the people whose dignity is not being respected, the people whose families are being torn apart, the people who are having to live in a tent encampment because there is no house that they can stay, that they can manage. We have to honor their dignity while we step out to be aware and learn of their conditions. And that's how we find love and grace, is through that interconnection that we have to make. We must walk lightly and listen and learn in the places where we stand and where we walk and where we plant ourselves. And in so doing, we can share more abundantly in that holy communion of human dignity. In good ways and bad, we know we are connected, so much more connected than we think. We know this interdependent web is ambiguous, with poverty, with violence, but also with beauty and nourishment. And that Beatles song, The Revolution, that reminds us that there isn't a quick fix. You know, just sign on the dotted line and you're all done. No. We all have known that for a while, that there's no quick fix. But we must not give up on human dignity, because our future is one future, a shared, connected future. And it includes everyone on this planet. So let us learn how the struggles and the health of all our communities do intertwine. And let us show up for the work that needs to be done and celebrate the victories and honor the dignity that we find in the work that we do. Let us walk lightly and listen and learn to heal the interdependent web. Amen.